Well, folks, we are so grateful to be here and so thankful to JFF for facilitating such a needed conversation right now. And I think that, when we're talking backstage, the goal for all of us is to help each other, all of us in this room, to better understand each other, get to a place where we're creating workplaces where everyone is welcome and affirmed for who they are. So thank you so much for hosting us today. We really appreciate it. Let's get started, because I have two of the most well-known advocates in the country. I am so excited to get this conversation going. Here's to both of you. What could we be doing right now to create workplaces that are more welcoming for all people, regardless of gender identity and sexual orientation?
Wow, hi everyone. What could we be doing now? I'll just tell you that, as a Black queer man who spent the weekend in Florida, and who does this work all the time, I was surprised at how anxious I was. I was surprised at how super aware I was of my Blackness, how super aware I was of my queerness. As my friends were driving around in the middle of the night trying to find our Airbnb, I was like, no, I'm Black, we're queer, we're not safe here. And so when I think about how real that is, and when I think about how our friends, our staff, our peers show up to work and the things that we sacrifice just to be able to exist, I think it's our responsibility as leaders, as presidents, as CEOs, to do our work. And a part of that work is taking a deeper dive into investing in people. I know we all have the best practices around DEI and training, but it really means that you have to invest in getting to know the people in your community, getting to know what's impacting them, what impacts the way they show up for work, what impacts queer, transgender people. If you think about what's happening in the world, we were talking backstage, I said, when we were smaller, the messages came from homophobia, sometimes from family members, things that we had to combat. But now we have a generation of young queer folks who are being erased by laws, by legislation. And what does that mean to internalize that? Now we have a generation of young people suffering from mental health challenges because of their LGBTQ identity, and we're gonna have, hopefully, data that we'll be able to use to build better ways to support them. So I think that we have to hold ourselves accountable. It's not enough to have DEI training, but we have to go deeper. We have to take a deeper investment into our managers and supervisors who are on the front lines, who are harming people every day by not doing their work. The work that you, as leaders, are required to do is to learn what it means to be culturally competent. It doesn't mean that you have all the right answers, but it does mean that you take the time to unlearn and relearn what it means to advocate for folks and what it means to build a work environment where people feel safe, seen, and valued.
That's so well said. Alexia?
First of all, thank you so much for being here. This is absolutely the first step, right? And probably for many of you, it is one of many steps you're taking, but hearing from queer people directly is so important, because what we are saying is we are terrified, we are under attack. And I think the most important thing for any of you in sort of whatever role you're in is to recognize sort of how historic this moment is in terms of the sort of formality of and the breadth of the attacks on queer people. There are more laws right now oppressing LGBTQ people than there ever have been in the history of this country. That is shocking, right? We think that progress only moves in one direction, and what we are seeing is the exact opposite. We are seeing state legislatures attack every aspect of queer people's basic rights, trans folks' ability to use the restroom. Literally, as on July 1st, when Florida's latest bathroom ban takes effect, I can be arrested for going to the bathroom And in fact, like the public is sort of encouraged to try to root me out from the bathroom and call me out. So there are attacks on just sort of our basic ability to move through the world. There are attacks on our access to healthcare. Taylor talked about the true epidemic of suicide among queer youth. The most effective solution to that for trans and gender nonconforming youth who want to receive gender-affirming care is to access gender-affirming care. It's like a miracle drug. I mean, the data is incredible, how it saves lives. And yet we have state legislatures across the country criminalizing that care. Idaho just passed a ban on gender-affirming care for minors that likens the provision of gender-affirming care to manslaughter under the Idaho Civil Code, subjecting doctors to 10 years imprisonment. I just actually filed a challenge to that law with the ACLU 2 weeks ago. And you know what's so striking about like that law and so many like it is when you go and look at what like the legislators who are passing these laws are saying. One of the legislators who supported and passed that law and sponsored that law said that they hope to erase transgenderism. There is no such thing as transgenderism. There's transgender people, right? There is no erasure of transgenderism without erasing transgender people. And that is just, you know, like that is what's happening right now. You know, likewise, you have these laws that are now banning sort of even the discussion of queerness in schools, which is obviously so insidious and harmful to kids, and also erases families like mine and Phil's, where we have children where if they're in school, they couldn't actually like speak about their families, right? So it's important for everybody to understand how profound sort of this moment is. If you might hear sort of in your lives or in your workplaces this idea that there's something sort of controversial about trans rights or LGBTQ rights right now, that it's too political, it's too controversial. One of the things you can do in your workplaces and your lives is just to push back on that narrative. Like, there is nothing political about our existence, our dignity, our ability to access basic rights. Like, these are not issues about which reasonable minds can differ. And having those conversations, pushing back, is actually so important. And then, you know, sort of in your workplaces and as you're implementing policies, there's doing all of the things, like some things that Taylor talked about, like making sure that there are all gender restrooms, which is so, so important, particularly in an environment where people are being encouraged to sort of pursue and root out and kick out people from bathrooms. And also, you know, you could please like make there a culture of pronoun use. That is so powerful, not just for folks who use pronouns that may be different than someone might expect just by looking at them, but just to sort of show and say, like, trans people exist, trans people have dignity, we are that kind of culture. So I'll leave it there for now. But
No, that is so well said.
What I was thinking about was also, like, how do you build a culture of practice? Because I think it's so hard for people because we get in our heads like, I don't want to cause any more harm. And so when the stakes are high is when we pull out the skills that we haven't even started to develop. So how do you build a culture of practice where you can talk through scenarios, talk through what's coming up for you, but also how can you affirm the queer people in your environment when things are so bad on the outside? When they come to work, what are some of the things that you can do to remind them that they're safe, that you're invested in them?
I mean, Phil, you know, among the many hats you wear, you are a professional educator. You know, what would be your advice to workplaces right now that are trying to improve how we talk about these things with colleagues, with folks from other work environments who may not have the same kind of culture, workplace culture that you might be in right now? What would be your advice to them?
Wow. I mean, there's so much. I mean, a lot of my research focused on teachers in schools, like what it meant to be a queer teacher in these spaces and how you show up and how you balance that with your identity. And I'll never forget, I had a queer chemistry teacher, and she told me for a week, She talks about her family. She talks about how she came out. In a chemistry class, they're talking about identity because she wanted her students to feel safe. She wanted her students to be on the front lines. She wanted to be on the front lines of really creating a space that was validating to them. And I can tell you, just as an educator, watching teens go through this process is hard enough. But having to study chemistry and also explain their identity and releasing some of the emotional labor on that, I was surprised when I was in graduate school at how many educators in their mid-careers had never had a conversation about identity, a conversation about what it meant to support, to validate queer students, trans students. They were just shocked. And I was like, you're in charge of our children. Like, this is your job. And many of us are afraid to have that conversation. So you really have to invest in resources. Again, we heard earlier today that we aren't doing enough around DEI. We're checking boxes, but what does it really mean to ask yourself, do we serve all people well? Do we serve all students well? Do we serve Black students, trans students, queer students? And really go through the list and do an inventory. Like, what are we missing? What are we lacking? Because as a parent, I assume that when I send my biracial son there with two dads to school, the school's done the work. They know how to support him. They know how to support us. I remember my son went to school. I had a list of questions for the teacher, and she said, Dr. McAdoo, I see that your son is adopted. And I was like, yes. I see that he has two dads, and I was like, oh shit, I like her. And she said, I just want to know what I can do to support your son and your family. And I was like, what? That's right? You see us, right? And so all the lists of questions that I had, they were gone because I knew from that initial meeting that she saw us, that she was invested in my son being successful, and she was going to protect him, and she was going to be an advocate for our parents. So I think the same is true as leaders, as teachers, when we look at our young people, when we look at our peers, look at people who are direct reports. Have we invested enough time in getting to know them? And the last thing I'll say is that, the summer of 2020, we were all invested in racial, equity and really making sure that we were doing the right thing. And we just held space. I said, let's just hold space to hear how people are experiencing the world. And a Black woman came to me and she said, Philip, this was the first time where I felt like I could bring my whole self to work. And I know we hear that all the time and we freak out, like, what are you talking about? But what she meant was, she said, I knew that we were going to come to work, that you were going to hold space, that we were going to talk about it, and I was going to be met with empathy and care. And then she said, then I could do my work, but it's the silence. It's the people pretending like nothing's happening, the people pretending like these laws aren't impacting our trans co-workers, and not saying anything instead of really creating this space to say, hey, Alexia, how are you doing today? I know the world feels pretty shitty, but what can I do? How can I show up for you? That's it. That's it. Yeah. Just be willing and open to learn and to see people. That's all you have to do.
It's that simple. Yeah. It's that simple. My goodness. I am so appreciative of allies who go into spaces where we can't, and they communicate things that we are not able to do so to people who may not listen to us, but they will listen to folks who are not from our experience, but of their experience. So Valerie Jarrett, who was just on the stage, she was instrumental in, during the Obama administration for pushing support for same-sex marriage. If she hadn't done that, who knows where we'd be right now? It's having people in those spaces fighting for us, advocating for us. By the way, not just LGBTQ people. DEI is not just for race, gender, and sexuality. It's for everybody. The military veteran who comes home from Iraq or Afghanistan and has a limb missing or his nerves shattered, he benefits from DEI as well. DEI is to make sure that no one gets left behind, period. That there is respect and dignity for all people in the workplace, at schools, at home, everywhere. And I wish that we would embrace that message more instead of just making it seem as though it's a framework that is only meant to benefit some people. It's meant to benefit all people, and I wish we'd all embrace that a little more. I do want to ask about this real quick, though. These anti-trans laws, anti-LGBTQ laws generally, do not just affect LGBTQ people. In fact, just this past week, there was a story out of Canada where there was a 9-year-old girl who was not transgender, who was at a track meet, and she was harassed by 2 older adults who accused her of being transgender because they said she, quote, looked transgender. We're going to be seeing a lot more of this, aren't we, Alexia?
That is exactly true. And just like, Charlotte, you were saying that like DEI is for all of us, like gender liberation is for all of us, right? When you have this really rigid notion that is literally inscribed in our laws about, who is a woman, who is a man, and that these are discrete categories and they're different in all of these ways. That hurts everybody, right? That enforces these really rigid gender stereotypes that have huge, as we all know in this room, effects in the workplace, right? When we talk about these notions of, even, sort of like the ways in which these laws that are anti-LGBTQ are really being passed by and really sort of coexisting with like abortion bans, right? All of these types of laws are designed to enforce a very rigid notion of gender. What is a woman? Who is a woman? A woman is someone who gives birth, who is pregnant, who is parenting, right? So what does that make a man? That doesn't make a man a parent, right? It hurts all of us. It hurts the dads who want to be really engaged. It certainly hurts women in all aspects of their lives, in the workforce for working parents and beyond, right? And so having this really rigid notion of, and this sort of heightened sort of hysteria and like focus on gender is so harmful to like a little girl who happens to be really fast, right? We now say, oh, she must be a boy. Like, it is incredibly corrosive. It is incredibly dangerous. And, it is really incumbent on all of us to sort of see the ways in which these laws harm all of us, right? And even if we're straight, even if we're cisgender.
Yeah.
This is for both of you. Oh, Philip, please, please.
I'll just add, I sit here, 20 years in a relationship, but only, what's today, the 14th? 14 days married. And that was an act of, thank you. 20 years. But that was an act of defiance because we saw what was happening to our rights as queer folks, to our rights as a queer family. I mean, and you talked about the binary around like what it means to be a queer family. Like so many times people like, well, who's the mother? Who's the, all those different things that you have to assert yourself for. Like I went to my partner, I was like, our son's struggling. I have more flexibility. I'm going to make that sacrifice that people tend to equate with being a woman or a more feminine role in the family. So just having to speak yourself into existence, it's really, it's a lot. And it's, again, the emotional labor. And we talk a lot about what it means to be a good ally, what it means to really advocate for a person who doesn't walk in our lived experience. So I think those are some really important questions that people need to ask themselves who are outside of the LGBTQ experience.
That's right. We want the freedom not to be a monolith as well. The queer community is as diverse as any community. I go to church every Sunday. I served honorably in the Army. We are all so different from each other, and yet as a community we come together to recognize each other's differences. And to recognize the beauty in who we are as queer people. And I think that's so important. And there's something very beautiful about it, a framework for what the future could be for humanity in general. I do want to get to this really quickly because we are running low on time. The state of LGBTQ rights in this country is abysmal. Alexia, you've had the great honor of working on 2 landmark cases, Windsor, of course, and also Dobbs. Could you explain what those are and why they're related and why it's so important to talk about why they're related in this particular moment in our history?
Yeah. So Windsor was the first of the 2 marriage equality cases, Obergefell being the second. And what Windsor stood for the proposition that the government had to recognize as legal and valid a marriage between 2 people of the same sex. And when we litigated the case, the Defense of Marriage Act was the law of the land, and it said that basically even if you are married in your state, the federal government's going to treat you as unmarried for the purposes of federal law. And in the decision in which we won that case, the court really sort of concluded that To say that a legally valid marriage, if just happens to be between queer people, is invalid is an affront to the dignity of queer people. It wasn't a decision about sort of like the sanctity of marriage, which I think Obergefell was in many ways, but it was about the dignity of people entering that marriage. And that, the decision to use the word dignity 11 times, I think about dignity so much every day, but especially now, because what are these laws sort of collectively? They're an absolute affront to our dignity. And of course, the Dobbs case was a much less happy tale. So this was the most recent Supreme Court abortion decision that we had brought on behalf of our long-standing client, the last abortion clinic in Mississippi, challenging the Mississippi's ban on abortion at 15 weeks. So for the last 50 years, the law of this land, affirmed again and again and again, has been that prior to viability, which is between 23 and 24 weeks gestational, it is just unconstitutional to ban abortion. You just can't do it. There's no like fancy sort of, you don't need a trial, you don't need to, it's just unconstitutional. So Mississippi really sort of cynically and blatantly passed a ban on abortion at 15 weeks, which was just, they passed it knowing it was unconstitutional. And really incredibly, you know, in the Dobbs decision, the Supreme Court upheld that ban and said it was constitutional. And in the course, of course, affirmatively sort of overturned Roe and Casey. And this marked the first time in American history that the courts have taken away from us, we the people, for whom the Constitution was written for, took a right away that we had enjoyed. That is extraordinary. It should terrify everybody in this room, regardless of how you feel about abortion, and regardless of whether you need to access abortion care in your lifetime. To be clear, of course, the history of this country is one in which whole swaths of people at various times have been denied rights in the first place, or have had rights on the books, but not in practice. But this, taking away from us a right that was granted to us, is extraordinary. And, you know, it marks really sort of an era of what I can only describe as the possibility for total chaos, right? Because in our system, the idea that you follow precedent, that there is stability in the rule of law, underpins all of our laws in the rights context, but really all of them. And so the fact that the Supreme Court really undid a decision that they had affirmed and firmed and reaffirmed almost more than any other decision, and including as recently as like a year prior to our case, means that really anything is on the table. Any rights are on the table. Marriage equality is incredibly vulnerable, and I think it is no sort of coincidence that since that decision, there has been this incredible proliferation of legislatures going after all sorts of rights, abortion rights, of course, but especially LGBTQ rights. You know, I have fewer rights today than I had a month ago, than I had a year ago. And it's all part and parcel of the same thing that should truly terrify all of us. We all enjoy rights, right? Whether we're straight, whether we're queer, we all enjoy rights. And all of that is now sort of up for grabs.
And just to be clear, because you are the one of the most qualified people in the country to answer this question, is same-sex marriage, is marriage equality safe right now?
No, I mean, it's really not. Because first of all, nothing is safe. If the Supreme Court could overturn Roe and Casey, there's no precedent that is safe. But also, you know, really sort of specifically, the way that our laws work is they really sort of build on each other, right? And so when you have these cases, you then have other cases that come and say, well, because of this case, then we can extend it a little bit further and we have these rights, and then something comes on top. And we're now toppling the cases that marriage equality, among other rights, were actually based on. And lest there sort of be any confusion, right, in his concurrence, Justice Thomas said that all of the other rights, including sort of marriage equality, are made up. They're based on the same sort of substantive due process, which he sort of considers a fake right. And if we are really going to, as sort of the Supreme Court did, look to the state of play, you know, in the 1800s, there are, you know, everybody who didn't have rights in the 1800s, black people, women, etc., are obviously not going to do well in a regime where that's where we're looking for sort of the basis for our laws.
That was a perfect answer. And Phil, like, I'm going to go to you for the last substantial question, then we're going to go to final thoughts. In most of the country right now, LGBTQ people still lack protection against discrimination in housing, credit, public accommodations, jury service, education. So in most of the country, if a queer person, if an LGBTQ person like Secretary Buttigieg, if he were to go to my home state of Texas and try to rent an apartment, he would most likely not have protections if the landlord or the property owner said, no, I don't want to rent to you because you're gay. And there would be no legal recourse against that at this time. What would you say to folks here about how that affects LGBTQ people living in states where we're seeing these laws passed? Do they have to move? Are they able to work there? Could you expound on that?
Wow, how many people knew that? Like, I will tell you as a queer man, I didn't know that there were certain rights that I didn't have around employment. Like, I didn't know that. As a fool, I was like, wait, what are you talking about? I went to an attorney, he was like, you have no right. They can do this to you. So I think the first thing is that we just need to become aware, right? And I don't like the term ally, so I really want, if we're gonna land that, if we're gonna own that, then we really need to own it, and people really need to step into that identity with force and say, what does it truly mean to be an ally, especially with queer folks, especially with queer youth, right? The damage that we're doing to queer youth, the things that they're seeing, that they're now questioning their identity, they're questioning who they are. The years and years and years of unpacking and therapy that's gonna take to be able to support them and hold them in the ways that we should. So I would question, like, what's this whole notion of being an ally? Like, what does that mean? What does it mean to be a mission-driven organization or a purpose-driven person, a person who lives a life with purpose, if we are going to turn our eye to what's happening? I think I was looking, there were 120 bills maybe in January, and now there may be about almost 500, right? In such a short amount of time. So, and, you know, I was just in Florida. I have lots of queer friends there, had a wonderful experience there years ago, but people aren't moving, right? People aren't moving. That's a part of who we are. And we talked about the ways that people are built. We are, as queer folks, we're built to last. My friends say drag queens aren't going anywhere. We aren't going anywhere. And so I think we really, yes, we really have to just really land and step into what I like when you said, Alexia, that we're all in this. We really are all in this, and this is a collective experience that we all have a role to play. Like, we really have a role to play, and sometimes I'm a little naive and thinking like, oh, 2015, we can get married. Is my book even relevant? And then, you know, 14 days ago saying, yes, we have to get married, and here are the reasons why. So I think there really needs to be a collective push, right, an awakening, so to speak, around all the things that we are collectively experiencing, and to your point, it impacts and in fact affects us all.
Well, goodness gracious, I really wish we could keep this going for the next couple hours, because I feel like we have a lot to talk about, but we're out of time. Folks, please give it up for Alexia and for Philip, wonderful advocates, and thank you to Jobs for the Future for facilitating this conversation. Thank you so much.